5.
Tesco's have joined other retailers trying to avoid using the dread word Christmas.
4.
And I think it would be absolutely terrible if we abandoned the idea here in the UK of wishing each other a happy Christmas.
3.
Shabana Mahmood, despite striking a pose of toughening up, was basically saying if you arrive illegally, you can work.
2.
The first principle is that you cannot tax your way to growth. If you put up corporation tax too much, you're going to be uncompetitive.
1. We have liftoff.
Welcome once again to Planet Normal, the Telegraph podcast with Alison Pearson.
Hello.
And me, Liam Halligan. The UK's being torn apart by immigration. I wish I could say there isn't a problem, and this is all an invention of the far right, but there most definitely is a problem. These were the impassioned words of Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood as she told the House of Commons about her plans to crack down on immigration. The Labour Party's proposals have caused outrage among the Lib Dems, Green Party and plenty of Labour MPs too. They've been dubbed to the right of both the Tories and Reform. But does Mahmood really mean it, and will her plans work? You think not, co-pilot, as you've outlined in Wednesday's Telegraph, link in the show notes to this episode. As legal and illegal immigration continues to soar, the number of UK nationals leaving is also spiralling upward. Some 257,000 left last year, we've just learnt, way above an earlier estimate of just 77,000. Many, it seems, are fleeing the joys of Rachel Reeves' upcoming budget, scheduled for next Wednesday. Meanwhile, as both Kemi Badenoch and Nigel Farage try to sharpen up their economic policies, we learn that inflation in October was slightly down at 3.6%, but prices remain elevated. And the official food price inflation rate of 4.9% over the last year will feel like a chronic underestimate to many shoppers. Before we get going, Alison, there are, as of Thursday, just 38 shopping days left to Christmas. And I think it's fair to say you won't be going to Tesco's for Pearson Tower's Christmas tree this year.
Certainly won't. What do they called it? Evergreen, or I thought it was a Barbara Streisand and Chris Christopherson song, isn't it? Evergreen.
Yeah, that and Wet. Remember she did that album,
yes,
Wet? And
yes.
She did Yentl as well. Yentl. She was amazing in Yentl with the little cap on and stuff.
Yes, Tesco's have joined other retailers trying to avoid using the dread word Christmas, because we all know ethnic minorities in our country, they do nothing, Liam, but complain about the use of the word Christmas. I mean, it's also factious, isn't it? It's all these sort of white, university-educated, posh, professional people ignoring what normal people like. I just don't buy it, really. I think there's a sort of censorship of traditions and things like that, which really doesn't have its origin in any of the non-white, non-Christian people in this country. It's just sort of fashionable wokery of the BBC sort. And by the way, Halligan, you're going to love this. So after our BBC tirade last week, I got an invitation to appear on Question Time.
Oh my God.
On Thursday, tomorrow, yes.
Into the Lion's Den.
Daniela in the Lion's Den. Yes.
Striding into the studio in Runcorn or wherever it's going to be, like Maximus in Gladiator.
I think the call at Broadcasting House must have gone out. Desperate call. Get us in some far-right blonde extremists. They thought that Pearson woman will do. Oh, I couldn't appear this week anyway because I'm doing a big event with Douglas Murray. But it's interesting, isn't it? Listeners may not understand this. You're very confident and I'm pretty confident, but you don't undertake those invitations lightly, really, because it's always unpleasant, isn't it? And you sit there and you do tell yourself, I'm representing the views of millions of ordinary people. I'm certainly representing the views of co-pilot Halligan and many of our beloved Planet Normal listeners. But we saw recently, didn't we, with you appeared not so long ago. And the minute you start saying something, there's a sort of censorious slapping down, isn't there?
You literally get hissed at. I personally think, while they do make some effort on Question Time and its sister programme on the radio, Any Questions, which is always a better conversation, by the way, because there's only 4 panellists on Any Questions rather than 5 on Question Time, because Question Time think readers are so moronic, you need to have some unknown comedian in the corner saying stuff. You get hissed at. And even though I think the producers do make some effort to make the audience representative, the audience is systematically infiltrated by political parties who have their stooges applying to be members. And the audiences I've encountered, many, many appearances on Question Time and Any Questions over the years, they always seem to be incredibly warm towards centre-left Labour Party policies, and they always seem very determined, with a lot of encouragement, often from the presenter, in trying to make someone like me feel as uncomfortable as possible, even though I'm saying things that are entirely mainstream and often economically literate when the rest of the panel's talking complete nonsense.
I do wonder, though, with reform having been over 30% in the polls, I think it's for about 110 consecutive polls now, the penny must be dropping, mustn't it, within the BBC?
But they can't dismiss the whole country as racist and far right, because that's Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables.
Really, yeah. And with, I think now, as we discussed last week, I think the BBC licence fee is very much in jeopardy now, particularly, obviously, not just following the Donald Trump story and the appalling anti-Semitism, but the Telegraph, as we record, Liam, has got a big story about parents now attacking the BBC for having done harm to their children with their absolutely astounding pro-trans coverage. Now that starts to get onto very, very serious terrain indeed, doesn't it, for the national broadcaster? So yes, I think the invitation to co-pilot Pearson was a sign of desperation, really. I have to say to listeners, actually, I don't know if they noticed, I know many of them watched your Question Time appearance with great pleasure, but the thing that really made me laugh, which you did, being a tricky Irish bugger, you said at one point, I'm looking out and I could see lots of people in the audience nodding, and I thought, no, they're not.
They were. They absolutely were. They were, but the camera wouldn't cut to them. There were people just delicately nodding because they don't want to upset other people in the audience.
Yeah.
There were definitely lots of people nodding, but it seems to me that the ones who speak out the most vociferous are so often in those audiences very much reflecting sort of metropolitan centre-left views, even if you're in far-flung parts of the country. And I must say, both those flagship BBC programmes do an excellent job of going around the country and going to lots and lots of different places. And I know people are paid for what they do, but there's obviously a lot of effort that goes into that. And I do think they're very valuable programmes. And I do think, the production staff, the technical staff and all of them do a great job. I want those programs to do well. I want those programs to be a kind of meeting point for the nation every week, both on the radio and the television and online. And like my general views about the BBC, I want it to succeed. It's a very precious thing. And yet it desperately needs saving from itself. I mean, we're still, since all the Trump stuff broke, and like you probably, I've been to lots of functions around Westminster and different parts of the country, talking to people about it. And, so many BBC people, they're still completely in denial. And their better presenters are still conveying this utter dross that there's some kind of right-wing conspiracy to undermine the BBC from within. I mean, you just keep getting loads of stuff wrong because you don't hire anyone who understands ordinary people.
Yes, but you're being far too reasonable. I mean, you always do this. I mean, I know I'm Mrs. Unreasonable.
It's all relative, darling.
But, years ago, I did Question Time and we were in Basingstoke and I thought, you'll be fine here, Alison. There'll be a few nice men in cord trousers, nice ladies with Margaret Thatcher hairdos.
Lots of Jeans and Rogers and Allens who will agree with you.
I mean, I looked out, it was a sea of Pip claimants. That's all I could say. I mean, it was absolutely no way there was anyone who'd like Margaret Thatcher sitting there. So I don't know what they do to get their balanced studio audience, but it's a joke. But, moving on, it is interesting, isn't it, with, obviously the BBC perhaps realising that they can't go on damning Nigel Farage voters, as there's more than a possibility that may be the next government that's determining the fate of the licence fee. But we've even now, haven't we, got the Labour Party with a very drastic turn to the right on immigration, in the sense that I think obviously Starmer's not just hugely unpopular. There's a perception that immigration, particularly illegal migration, which we've talked about at length because of our asylum seeker whistleblower. But the red wall now is collapsing for Labour. So this week we had Shabana Mahmood, the Home Secretary, taking a much more fiery line on illegal migration, on asylum seekers, and putting on a very combative performance in the House of Commons when she said she knew personally how divisive, out of control migration had become.
I wish I had the privilege of walking around this country and not seeing the division that the issue of migration and asylum system is creating across this country. Unlike him, unfortunately, I am the one that is regularly called a and told to go back home. It is I who knows through my personal experience and that of my constituents just how divisive the issue of asylum has become in our country.
So I think Shabana Mahmood, kind of realistic appraisal, Liam, that this failure to defend borders makes life more unpleasant for people like Shabana Mahmood, her parents and extended family, because what's happening, I guess, inevitably, is that legitimate immigrants who've come here, followed all the proper channels, have arrived, have tried to blend in, worked very hard, become taxpayers, that they too get on the rough end of a sort of poisonous drip of why are we letting these bloody people in? I want to know what you think about what she said, but I should put my cards on the table. I felt that she talked a good game of being tough, saying that they were being inspired by Denmark's plans. We'll talk about that in a minute, because Denmark's plans were far, far more draconian than anything the Labour government has come in. But I just wanted to say this, Liam, because this is something that she wasn't trumpeting, and it is quite astonishing. The government's new asylum policy creates a two-step system. People who arrive illegally and are granted protection are put in a new category called core protection for 30 months. If they can then find a job or a place to study, they can switch into a new category called the protection, work and study route. And those illegal migrants will be moved off the core asylum route and onto a work, study, migration route. Now, that's a lot of jargonese, but what that means, Liam, is there is now a bigger incentive to come to the UK, because until now, the government's held the line that illegal migrants must not be allowed to work. And that's been very, very important, even though, of course, they all do Deliveroo and so on. But now, Shabana Mahmood, despite striking a pose of toughening up rules, is basically saying if you arrive illegally, you can work. I think that's a disaster.
I think it's important to say she hasn't gone the full Danish, right? What happened in Denmark, and Mette Frederiksen is a very successful centre-left politician. It's clearly inspired Shabana Mahmood to take this risk, and it is a big risk. I know you feel, and I think I agree with you, the reforms are at the moment more rhetorical than they are real. And in the end, it will be hard for her to get these past the Labour Party, let alone the other parties, if she needs to, if there is some kind of parliamentary pushback against her reforms. And Kemi Badenoch, I think, cleverly has said early, we will help the government get these reforms through. But what happened in Denmark is that Mette Frederiksen, she came in and she dealt really early growing immigration problem in Denmark. And so there's been very little room left for the more right-wing party in Denmark, People's Party. Their votes collapsed since Frederiksen came in. But her approach has been, if there's a legal challenge, bring it on. Her approach has been, to get zero asylum, whereas Mahmood still feels that asylum is part of the UK's duty, and she's still reticent, I think, to do things if civil servants tell her that they're illegal and there's going to be some kind of judicial review. And she doesn't, of course, want to leave the ECHR the way both Reform and now the Tories argue is essential if we aren't going to be stopped by distant overseas judges from deporting people when we want to deport them as a government and as a country. So I think there's an awful long way to go here in terms of actual changes on the ground until you'll see these numbers of illegal migrants coming down, until these reforms will act as some kind of deterrent to people getting on small boats. But it is actually astonishing that Labour's rhetoric has changed so quickly on a sixpence. And it is astonishing that Mahmood is now going for this in the way that she is. And it may be that it's this rather than spending cuts which causes the mother of all breakdowns within the Labour Party. Because while Shabana Mahmood may speak for lots of the country in what she says, and opinion polls certainly suggest that she does, a lot of Tories in Parliament will think that she's going OTT here, let alone the vast swathes of the Labour backbenchers. So I think there's tremendous political risks here for her. And I think I agree with you that when it comes to it, Labour will bottle it.
Well, I think this is bottling it already. I think it's really targeted at the Labour voters who've defected to reform. Now, Nikki, who's our whistleblower in the asylum system, I spoke to her about it this week, and she said, frankly, the Mahmood plans won't make a blind bit of difference as long as the illegals know they're not going to be deported. They'll keep coming, and we hardly deport any of them because there isn't the manpower or the willpower. I'm not sure, Liam, that the British people have got any idea how absolutely astonishingly bad the Home Office is. And Nikki said, I did find this absolutely astonishing. She said that currently when an asylum claim is declined, there is no follow-up. So the failed asylum seeker will get a refusal letter. She actually sent me a copy of the letter. It says, you should make your own arrangements to leave the UK. You can imagine, can't you?
She's packed the steamer trunk. We're heading for Hogwarts. Oh my God. The BBC chase their licence fees with more determination than the state chases asylum seekers whose claims have been ill-founded.
Yeah, this is not erecting a huge metal barrier around the UK. This is a Peppa Pig windbreak, Liam. This is really not going to do anything at all. I was really interested to dig down, might be interested as well, to see what Denmark did. And first of all, Denmark was not afraid or ashamed to say they wanted to protect the Danish way of life. And they have continued to publish data, such as in 2018, immigrants made up around 14% of Denmark's population, but were responsible for 29% of violent crime. Now, that's the kind of statistic that it's extremely difficult to get out of our Home Office. We have sort of informal information that there's tremendous link between certain sort of Afghans, Eritreans, more likely to commit sexual crime than British nationals. But it's very, very hard to extract that kind of information. In fact, we see the British state really trying to cover it up. But, in Denmark, they openly called these ghettos of migrants parallel societies. And if a neighbourhood had more than 50% immigrants and it was scoring badly on joblessness or crime, then it was officially designated a ghetto, and steps were taken to move families to a more mixed area, busing, if you like, as we saw happen, of course, all those years ago in the United States, and even to physically bulldoze the community. And Denmark had a no ghettos by 2030. Well, that was actually official policy. Can you imagine anyone trying to do that in Shabana Mahmood's Birmingham Ladywood constituency? And there was one policy I thought was particularly good in Denmark. Any child of immigrants from the age of 1 upwards has to attend mandatory daycare for 25 hours a week to learn the Danish language, Danish values, such as equality between the sexes, or their families would lose benefits. Now, that's what's going to make sure that immigration happens, not letting tiny little girls in playgrounds in Tower Hamlets effectively be wearing, top to toe covering and so on. And Denmark did manage to drive asylum down to a 40-year low. What we saw, Liam, was a country which absolutely could see the damage that illegal migration and excessive immigration from non-Western countries was doing, not just to its culture, but to working class communities, which were being, their housing was too expensive. And the employment minister, a guy called Kara Dybvad, who I saw interviewed by a horrified Channel 4 journalist, said, we don't think we should hide the GDP per capita in different ethnic groups. We think it's important to discuss it because it gives an idea of where the problems are. So what we lack in the UK is the honesty to face up to what this mass demographic change has meant. But as I said in the column this week, I think we're seeing now down in Crowborough, the Winnie the Pooh forest, if you can believe it, they're about to dump 600 young male asylum seekers on that small rural community. And I would predict, Liam, that in the next couple of years, we are going to see people getting extremely upset as the consequences, the baleful consequences of admitting these bored young males from Afghanistan, Sudan, Eritrea, Syria and Pakistan, and putting them into places like rural East Sussex start to hit home.
What you're seeing now ahead of the budget, which is Wednesday, the 26th of November, you're seeing the Tories in particular, but also Reform, trying to link the tax rises that are coming down the track. We can talk more about that. Obviously, Rachel Reeves' U-turn, she ridiculously floated the idea with financial markets of a 1 or 2p increase in the basic rate of income tax. Now, the markets would prefer a spending cut, but a tax rise is at least an attempt to demonstrate that you can take political pain in order to try and improve the budgetary situation. The thing about an income tax rise is that you will definitely get the money, certainly in the short and medium term, because it's not like people are going to avoid their PAYE taxes. You can't. Reeves has now abandoned that, and she's going for much, much sneakier tax rises like freezing thresholds, other changes that will hit people really hard without the garish headlines being as obvious as the first tax rise since the mid-1970s. So there is going to be an increase in the tax burden. There is going to be an increase in fuel duty and a whole rake of other burdens placed on firms and households. And the Tories and indeed Reform are now trying to link those tax rises directly to an increase in immigration. It used to be the case that the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, would see rising immigration as a sort of fiscal positive. But even the OBR now, particularly their head of strategy, an economist called David Miles, who I think by the standards of public sector economists is a pretty courageous bloke. He's also a very smart bloke who I've known for many years, Professor David Miles. And he has really been leading the charge from within the OBR. He's one of their top 3 analysts, very senior figure. He's been leading the charge within the OBR to change that narrative that more immigration isn't always and everywhere a good thing, because it costs a lot of money when a lot of the immigrants are unskilled and aren't working. And that is a big change. And so, I'm just looking at some numbers now. Back in the spring of 2022, there were fewer than 900,000 foreign nationals claiming universal credit. There's now way over 1.2 million. That's a huge increase in just a little over 3 years. And I do think the narrative has now changed. And I do think it's largely because of the symbolism of all this illegal migration and the hotels and the related concerns about safety, particularly female safety. But we must never forget the small boat numbers, the illegal migration numbers, while absolutely infuriating to many people and deeply symbolic of a state that's failed even to secure its borders, those numbers are dwarfed by the much bigger numbers of legal migrants. And that's where less of the debate is, but where more of the debate needs to be, I think, because we're still having massive net immigration, particularly of unskilled people. And that's something which was meant to change with Brexit, and it's been completely given rocket boosters by Brexit. That's not because we left the European Union. It's because our politicians have failed to use the controls that leaving the European Union has given them. And I think there is real disconsternation now. And as I say, this could easily be the real schism across the Labour Party that does for Keir Starmer. It'll be very, very interesting to see how this budget plays out next Wednesday.
Did you see there was quite a funny meme, which is a picture of Rachel Reeves beaming with an award? It was Dubai Real Estate Agent of the Year.
Yeah, because so many people have moved.
So many people have moved. And as you said at the top, 257,000 people left Britain last year. That's triple the estimate. And this exodus, Liam, these are productive, driven taxpayers, aren't they? And why are they leaving? Well, higher taxes attached to poor public services, unaffordable housing. I mean, how many how many kids in the late 20s, 30s could look up and think, oh, I'm going to be able to have a place of my own. Lack of job opportunities, often to do with firms not offering opportunities because they are closing or contracting because of the high energy prices. So everywhere these people look, particularly younger people starting their lives, the people we really need to drive our economy, they're departing, aren't they? And it's an absolute tragedy. And I think it comes back to that point about the Shabana Mahmood stuff on immigration, where she said, oh yeah, we will deport people as soon as their home country is deemed to be safe to deport them to. Well, to which 60 million Britons would say, how is it safe for us for them to be here? So everything needs to be overturned. And I noticed that, as you said, there was a Tory press conference this week on the economy where Kemi quite rightly said that Labour tax rises, which, as you say, Liam, are going to be sneakily freezing the tax thresholds, not actually openly increasing taxes. But these tax rises are about protecting benefits, often for foreign people, rather than protecting the people who are working. And it was interesting to see Reform been very strong on this tack, Nigel Farage and his head of policy, Zia Youssef, setting out the savings they would make, saying they could save £25 billion by cutting foreign aid, raising the NHS surcharge for foreigners, and removing universal credit for all EU citizens. I'm not sure. I mean, they sound good, don't they? I'm not sure how feasible they are. I met at the Battle of Ideas, Liam, a nurse came up to me, a male nurse actually, and he said that when he tried to ask EU nationals to pay money in the hospital, that his very lefty colleagues thought that was very bad form to be actually charging people as we would be charged anywhere in the European Union. Do you think that Reform could remove universal credit for all EU citizens? I mean, do you think that's a goer?
It is possible, Alison, but it will need primary legislation. So I doubt it's going to happen under this government, because a lot of their own backbenchers, as well as the Lib Dems, who have over 70 parliamentary seats, let us not forget, will counter that. I think what I'd say also is that it feels more and more like the mid-1970s. We're not going to get that which we got under Dennis Healey, remember him, though I do think we're going to get tax rises equivalent to that rise in income tax. And by the way, when you raise thresholds at the bottom end rather than raising the actual rate of income tax, that disproportionately hurts lower paid people, by the way. So Labour are sacrificing lower paid people, doing something that's the opposite of progressive, freezing a tax threshold rather than raising the rate in order to present their tax increases in a way that's more convenient to them. But what I would say is, back in the 70s, going back to my own personal experience, I'm from a big family, and lots of my aunts and uncles, working class people, tradespeople, secretaries and so on, they moved to America, they moved to Australia, they moved to Canada. A lot of my cousins went overseas in that period. London, I remember, hollowed out to about 7 million people. And there was lots and lots of empty homes and lots of dormant building sites as so many people left. It was like an exodus. And I do think the same thing is going to happen this time. And I remember that period, Alison, because to go back to your Tesco Christmas tree, that was when I realised that for all the brilliant things about America, Starsky and Hutch and the Brady Bunch and all the rest of it, America had this really annoying habit, even back in the mid to late 70s, of putting on their Christmas cards, not Happy Christmas, but Happy Holidays. And I think it would be absolutely terrible if we abandoned the idea here in the UK of wishing each other a happy Christmas, whatever our backgrounds, whatever our religion, whatever our ethnicity. That is being part of British, wishing each other happy Christmas, whoever you are and wherever you're from. Our Planet Normal guest this week, ahead of Rachel Reeves' budget on Wednesday the 26th of November, is Liz Truss. It's just over 3 years since the former Prime Minister's much-discussed mini-budget. Along with her Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng, Truss unveiled a package of supply-side measures designed to boost economic growth back in October 2022. She wanted to reverse a planned increase in corporation tax, keeping the headline rate at 19%, while cutting the top rate of income tax from 50 to 45%. Truss also pledged support for firms and households hit with soaring energy bills following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. After the mini-budget, the cost of government borrowing spiked upwards with knock-on effects for mortgages and other personal and corporate loans. Truss's detractors, including many in her own party, blamed her and quoting 100%, claiming financial markets had rejected the idea of lowering taxes to boost growth and to rein in the size of the state. That remains conventional wisdom among many political and media observers to this day. Yet a growing number of professional economists have pointed to the role of the financial authorities in causing the spike in UK government borrowing costs, specifically a failure to regulate debt-dependent, liability-driven investments, and the Bank of England's announcement just before the mini-budget that it would be selling tens of billions of pounds worth of government IOUs back into the market. Both these factors helped to destabilise sovereign bond markets, as did pre-mini-budget statement leaks from the Office for Budget Responsibility. On top of that, for the last year under Labour, long-term government borrowing costs have been way above levels in the aftermath of Liz Truss's mini-budget, yet there's been none of the media or political clamour which saw her ousted from Downing Street after just 49 days in office. The legacy of Liz Truss, no longer an MP, but still an influential voice on both sides of the Atlantic, hangs over the current Parliament. With growth still sluggish and the UK heading for a fiscal crisis, it seems, some MPs now privately admit she was right to challenge the big state, big borrowing, big spending views which continue to dominate our politics. I started by asking Liz Truss, 3 years on from that mini-budget, what we've learnt.
I think we've learnt, first of all, what happens when you don't implement the policies of the mini-budget, i.e. you raise taxes, you raise the cost of energy, you increase spending, which is, as I predicted, debt goes up, growth stagnates, and you end up in a worse position than you were in the first place. That's why we put in place the mini-budget measures back in 2022, because I could see that raising corporation tax, not getting on with things like fracking, not dealing with the sclerotic planning system, and having all these tax rises, things like getting rid of duty-free shopping, getting AR35, which hurts the self-employed. What we're now seeing is an exodus of companies from Britain, an exodus of millionaires and professionals from Britain, and we are in an economic doom loop of the Treasury constantly demanding higher taxes and the sort of golden goose of the private sector being killed off.
So here you are, Liz Truss. You're in this position where quite a lot of professional economists, I say, would agree with you broadly that we need to lower taxes, that we need to show Britain's open for business, that we need to get out of this doom loop. Yet on the other hand, among much of the political and media class as a whole, your name is still a byword for how not to run a budget. How do we get in this position?
Well, first of all, people have to understand that there is an awful lot of vested interest in the status quo. And everybody from the Bank of England governor to the Treasury to both the Labour and the Conservative Party backed the economic consensus we've had for the last 30 years, which was pursuing net zero, pursuing mass migration, believing that you can continue to raise taxes and it won't damage the revenue brought in. In short, it's Keynesianism. And they did not like being challenged. I was wrongly blamed for what happened in 2022. Subsequently, the Bank of England have admitted that most of the market movement was actually down to their failure to regulate pensions. But until we move on and actually challenge this economic consensus, then we are not really going to get to the bottom of why this economic performance has been so bad. And it's not just been bad for 5 years or 10 years. It's been bad for over 20 years. And we're now poorer than Mississippi. We're 50% worse off per capita than the United States. We're falling behind countries in Eastern Europe, and people are poorer than they were. And the problem we've got at the moment is the people behind the economic consensus, and I include the current chancellor in this, simply don't want to believe it. And I'm a convenient person for people to throw mud at. But if you look at the numbers, it's pretty obvious that this is a long-term problem. And I was the one person, I would argue, who was actually trying to fix it and trying to change it.
Let's be completely clear here, Liz Truss. Do you think the Bank of England and the Office for Budget Responsibility, both in their policy moves and the documents that were leaked to the press at key moments in your premiership, did they oust you, those organs of the state?
They certainly sabotaged me. And what they did was blame me, in the case of the Bank of England, for their own failings. So the Bank of England issued a report in 2024 being clear that 2/3 of the market movement in 2022 had been down to the failure to regulate LDIs, which was nothing to do with me, and I knew nothing of when we put the mini budget forward. Also, the day before the mini budget, they announced the sale of £40 billion worth of government gilts, which queered the pitch.
Made it tougher for your government to borrow.
Of course. And when
they could have done that at any time. They could have announced that at any time.
The first time they did it, it was the night before the mini budget. They certainly didn't want to be helpful. And when things got worse, which was largely down to their failure on LDIs, they pointed the finger at me. And the broader economic establishment, the Treasury, the mainstream media, many financial journalists, they want to believe the Bank of England rather than an elected politician. But I think there's a second issue, Liam, which is the process itself is very broken. And this is what I was trying to deal with back in 2022. And during the leadership election for the Conservative Party, I said the OBR process doesn't work. I said we've got a problem that the Bank of England is unaccountable, that they are pursuing quantitative easing, which has had terrible effects on asset prices and the balance between young people and old people in our country. I critiqued the entire process, and I said what we need to go back to is first principles. The first principle is that you cannot tax your way to growth. If you put up corporation tax too much, you're going to be uncompetitive. The basic principle that having some of the highest energy prices in the world is not going to attract businesses to your economy. And that was what my budget was based on. It wasn't based on this is the OBR's prediction for 5 years hence, which we know is always wrong. It was based on what are the key principles that are needed to make the economy grow and get the country back on the right track. And, we've now seen with Rachel Reeves and this ludicrous volte-face when the OBR suddenly said there was £20 billion more available than there had been the day before. This is why the process is so ludicrous. And the problem is the entirety of the political and economic establishment would rather play sort of monkey tennis with these numbers than actually say, what is the fundamental issue with the British economy? And that is what I was trying to say in 2022. And now people are starting to say, oh, the OBR process doesn't work. Well, yes. And that is part of the reason this country is in such a mess, that we have a fiscal policy that's run by the OBR. We have monetary policy that's run by the Bank of England. The Chancellor, unless they act as, Kwasi and I did and actually try and do something different to what those bodies are advocating, nothing will change.
What would you do with the OBR now? What would you do with the Bank of England now if you were back in Downing Street?
Well, the reason I didn't get rid of the OBR, which I dearly would have loved to do, and I think I advocated it in the leadership election, was it required primary legislation. And we simply didn't have the time to get that primary legislation through. And, the other factor in 2022 was I had lots of Conservative MPs who wanted Rishi Sunak to be leader of the Conservative Party rather than me. So this is the point, was it just the Bank of England and OBR? No, it wasn't. It was also a group of Conservative MPs who fundamentally don't believe in supply-side economics or don't care about supply-side economics as simply venal. So, that was a problem. So I had to do things that we were able to do on a fairly rapid timescale, and passing primary legislation, we simply didn't have time. But the OBR needs to go. Has the British budget got more responsible since the OBR was invented in 2010? No, it hasn't. It's been a catalogue of failure.
And what would you do with the Bank of England, Liz, if you were back in Downing Street?
Well, again, I think the big mistake was under the Blair government of making the Bank of England unaccountable. And the Bank of England Act, I believe it was 1998, preceded a whole period where we've had mismanagement of monetary policy, and there has been very little political intervention in that. I mean, the Bank of England have decided to pursue a Keynesian policy, but they have had no democratic mandate to do that. And, we saw the results after the financial crash, which is we've had massive quantitative easing, huge rises in inflation. Why is it so hard for young people to get on the housing ladder now? Well, one of the main reasons is the Bank of England's monetary policy, but none of those people were
Which
ever
bid up
elected.
the price of assets, including houses.
Yeah, exactly. So the Bank of England needs to be properly accountable to the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, and they simply aren't.
In retrospect, before we come on to Rachel Reeves' budget and what you would do in that, in retrospect, while you wanted to abolish the OBR, what you actually tried to do, you tried to abolish it in real time, didn't you? You ignored it, even though it was an ongoing organisation. You didn't tell the OBR what was going to be in your mini budget. Even though you feel the thrust of what you were doing was right, and I'd say, again, quite a lot of professional economists would agree with you, don't you think it would have been better to have taken that time to abolish the OBR with primary legislation before you tried to ignore it?
So if we'd taken the time in primary legislation, and bear in mind there were lots of Conservative MPs who didn't want to abolish the OBR, such as Mel Stride, the current Shadow Chancellor, who used his position at the time as chairman of the Treasury Select Committee to try and undermine the mini budget. We would have spent a year arguing within the Conservative Party about it, and we would have got absolutely nothing done. So I didn't think it was a viable prospect at the time. The fact is that according to the law at the time, the OBR only needed to be consulted twice a year. So we didn't need to consult the OBR. It was perfectly legal what we did. And in fact, the OBR wasn't consulted when there were big spending announcements.
And it wasn't a full budget, was it? You would say it was a so-called mini budget.
So the OBR wasn't consulted about Rachel Reeves' spending review. It wasn't consulted about Rishi Sunak's furlough spending, but they didn't get any flack. And this is the point, that there is an agenda there to attack anybody pursuing supply side policies and not pursuing the Keynesian agenda that is pushed by the Treasury and pushed by the Bank of England and the OBR. So I was judged by completely different standards than the standards Rachel Reeves is being judged by. And the amount that we were, even if you take the OBR's costings, the tax cuts amount were a lot less than what Rachel Reeves did in the spending review, but she didn't get an OBR forecast. So I just think this is all deliberate smearing by people who don't want things to change. And I guess my message, Liam, is if people actually want a proper economic policy of the kind that Javier Milei is pursuing in Argentina or Donald Trump is pursuing in America, these economic institutions have to be made accountable, or in the case of the OBR, have to be abolished. It simply is not possible to deliver a decent budget with them still in those positions, because they will simply sabotage it and undermine it.
I think it's fair to say, Liz, that your name is still used as a term of abuse in a lot of policy discussions in Westminster and on the airwaves and such.
That's completely facile.
Yeah, but it does strike me that you're winning the argument. Do you think you're winning the argument?
I do think I'm winning the argument. Yeah. People aren't attacking the actual policies I put forward. They're not attacking the fact that corporation tax has got too high and has made Britain uncompetitive. They're not attacking the idea of fracking directly and the fact it would have reduced energy prices. One of the policies we were advocating was increasing welfare by wages, not prices, which would have saved 7 billion, and which Conservative MPs objected to. people are now saying the welfare budget is too big. So
And maybe
all
the
of
triple lock can't be afforded and so on.
well, potentially, but all of the policies we put forward, nobody attacks the policies. What they attack is the process. And then they say, well, you didn't listen to the OBR. The point is, neither did Rachel Reeves when she increased spending. So these arguments are all extremely superficial. They're not about the substance. And one of the big problems in British politics is people are not talking about the substance, about why our economy is in such a massive mess. And I'm afraid things are going to get worse and they're going to have to talk about it.
I think it's fair to say that in recent months, your own party, the Conservatives and Reform, have started to stand up for fiscal reality a little bit more, haven't they? They've started to move away from endless promises of spending rises. They've started to talk about cost controls, particularly the Tories. What would you do now, Liz, if you were in office? Would you abolish the triple lock? Would you go for proper welfare spending controls? Would you still want to, well, you never wanted to lower corporation tax. You wanted to keep corporation tax at 19, didn't you? You were trying to reverse an increase before the increase actually happened. Would you instantly go back to 19? Or do you think we've got to wait a bit now, given where financial markets are?
I think we're above the Laffer curve on corporation tax, on duty.
So a higher rate will lead to even less revenue.
You have to be prepared to make that argument.
Yeah.
And you can't make the argument if the OBR is scoring the opposite, which is why I think the OBR going is a necessary condition to actually be able to change.
Why do they score the opposite? Is that just their ideology?
It's their ideology.
You think they're ideologically averse to the Laffer curve, the OBR?
Correct. The head of the OBR used to be at the Resolution Foundation, which is a left-wing think tank, which Torsten Bell, the Treasury Minister, also worked at. They're ideologically committed to Keynesian economics.
And a bigger state.
And those people are literally marking the homework of the Chancellor and directing fiscal policy. And while they're still there, that will continue.
So what would you do now? What would be your main thrust of your main policies?
Put corporation tax back to 19%. Abolish IR35. I think you also need to
make life easier for freelancers, of course.
Yeah, don't give benefits to migrants. The cost of migrant benefits has massively increased. I think you need to rein in universal credit. I think it goes far too high up the income scale. We shouldn't be raising the minimum wage as much as we are. It's now the situation that graduates are earning pretty much the minimum wage because the differentials have been reduced. But actually, some of the most important things, Liam, are on the supply side. It's getting rid of the planning restrictions and make it so hard to build anything. It's fracking so we can lower the price of energy. Our price of energy is currently 4 times what the US's are. And it's killing off industry. It's killing off the steel industry, the car industry, the AI industry, which depends on cheap energy. You've got to do all of those things. And this is just an extended version of what I was seeking to do in 2022, because until the country starts having an entrepreneurial private sector that is growing, we are just in a decline loop.
Can we afford the triple lock?
I would definitely change the way we do it. I think it's a very arbitrary measure. I think that over time, the retirement age needs to rise. However, that's not going to save you any money in the short term.
Yeah.
Because you can't penalize today's pensioners who aren't actually, in general, particularly well off.
Yeah.
The things that will save you money in the short term are the welfare budget and doing things like cutting the number of government departments. But even the cutting of the number of departments will take a few years to come through because you've got to pay redundancy to the civil servants. And this is why in 2022, we wanted to save 7 billion from the welfare budget, because that is the easiest money to save quickly.
And finally, Liz, you're still a member of the Tories. How do you think they're doing? And what's your advice to Kemi?
Well, my advice to Kemi is she has to be honest about the failings of the Conservative government. And they go back to before David Cameron being elected. There was too much of we want to be the heir to Blair, accepting the settlement that Blair and Brown had put forward, whether that was the lack of accountability of the Bank of England, whether it was things like the Human Rights Act, which is stopping us deporting illegal immigrants. Essentially, with a few exceptions such as Brexit and securing trade deals, there was a failure to reverse the Blairite constitutional settlement, the Blairite economic settlement. And we're now at the end game of Blairism. This is the era where Blairism is going badly wrong. The economy is in a negative doom loop. And I think Kemi has to acknowledge the failings of the Conservative Party over that entire period.
Liz Truss, thanks a lot for coming back on Planet Normal.
Thank you. Good to be on.
It's worth saying, Alison, that at the height of the so-called mini-budget crisis in October 2022, the UK's 30-year gilt yield, cost of long-term government borrowing, did go above 4%. And there was mass panic and all the offices of the state went into gear to oust her effectively, both the political and the administrative offices of the state. And that was when gilt yields went above 4%. They've been above 5% for the whole of this year. Now, yields have gone up around the world, but they've gone up particularly sharply in the UK. And we have easily the highest government borrowing costs in the G7, long-term government borrowing costs. And that has barely caused any remarks. And also, it's worth saying, Argentina are playing England at rugby this coming Sunday. And Liz Truss there mentioned Javier Milei, the president of Argentina, who's imposed really draconian controls, the chainsaw president. And growth has surged upwards and unemployment has plunged from above 200% to about 30% a year. And Argentina is starting to attract inward investment. And I was at an event last week. I watched Kemi Badenoch give a talk at the Argentina-UK summit, which I also spoke at, and I wrote about it in my Sunday Telegraph column, link in the show notes to this episode. Kemi Badenoch was there, and she was calling Milei a template. She was saying she wants to be the UK's Milei. She said that this underrated, pretty eccentric, former tantric sex coach who cloned his dog, he's been sniffed at and sneered at and jeered at. And yet, in the words of the leader of the opposition, he is showing the value of honest, authentic policies and sticking with difficult things when you need to stick with them. And it's a really interesting change. Suddenly, the UK, one of the great economies of the world, is taking its cue how to manage itself from one of the most volatile emerging markets in human history.
Perhaps this is where we're going wrong, Liam. We can't imagine Rachel Reeves being a tantric sex coach, can you? It was interesting, wasn't it? I mean, I think Liz Truss, I think she makes extremely plausible arguments and she clearly cares very much about the mess that the country's in. And to hear her say that, as you've just pointed out, she was judged by completely different standards to Rachel Reeves. And why is that? There does seem to be this ideological bias within the system and these very, very determined guardians of the status quo who had to bring Liz and Kwasi Kwarteng down. I'm not defending the speed at which they did things, but it certainly seems like they were on the right track. But if we look at what Liz calls the Blairite settlement, we see it everywhere, don't we, Liam? We see it in the failure of multiculturalism and immigration, which is now gradually coming to a head, how badly wrong that's gone, and certainly the economy now. And I think that's the thing that worries me most about what Liz Truss says, is that even someone who's the Prime Minister can be got at by these progressive, quote unquote. We'll remember that Maurice Glasman explained that progressive was what they said when you had a particularly nasty cancer. So the so-called progressive forces in the system vetoing what now look like pretty good sound ideas for pulling us out of the mud.
Now on to our listener emails. The messages you send us at planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk. Please keep them coming. We learn so much from you, the citizens of Planet Normal.
We had a flood of emails about the BBC. This is Annalise. Dear Alison, Liam, I'm so angry I can barely speak, says Annalise. My husband and I have for several years only watched the BBC News to see whether they have mentioned various news items, like the Farmers' March, to take one example, or to hear how they have managed to skew the truth But even we didn't think they would sink this low. To hear the establishment in various forms refer to the splicing of Trump's speech as a mistake is unbelievable. A mistake? They deliberately took a number of actions to mislead a whole nation about the world's most powerful man. That is not a mistake. It is, in my mind, criminal. And if it isn't criminal, it damn well should be. And then we have all the other absolute nonsensical rubbish, says Annalise. For 2 years, I've listened to the likes of smarmy, self-absorbed, arrogant Jeremy Bowen, Jeremy of Arabia, as we call him around here, trying to brainwash me into believing that the Hamas-run health ministry is telling me the truth and that Israel is somehow the enemy. I've spent 2 years shouting at my telly, she sounds like me, Liam, and turning it off in disgust as I hear the phrase Israel's war on Gaza, as if this is some one-sided attack by bully boys on a nation that apparently only consists of innocent babies and women. Well, it may cost me hard-earned money, but I am relishing the truth coming out, and I shall delight in all the oh-so-smug progressives, quote-unquote, an oxymoron if ever there was one, wiping the egg off their I'm-so-kind and virtuous faces. Go get 'em, Mr. Trump. With all best wishes and so much gratitude to you both, Annalise.
This is from Marcus. Hi, Alison and Liam. I've been a follower of your podcast from the very beginning. We now have 4 million people on benefits in the UK without having to look for work, as reported by the Telegraph. I'm a self-employed electrician. I often work 6 days a week, 5:30 alarm every morning. I have 2 very young children. I have 1 week off the entire year for a family holiday. It's exhausting. I received a letter yesterday saying I now have to do quarterly tax returns on top of my annual returns, which I pay an accountant to do. It's all now has to be done digitally, and I may need to get some new software, as if I've got the time and energy and money to do all that. I've now decided to drop below the VAT threshold. I deliberately won't expand. I won't take on any staff or train an apprentice. I now let the customer pay the wholesaler direct, so I don't have to take the revenue. I'll not give this government a penny more than I absolutely have to. I'm just a tiny business, but this must be repeated across the private sector as a whole. How dare the government claim it's for growth? It all feels totally pointless, working hard and investing for the future. I suspect the Labour government despise the self-employed and would rather we were all PAYE or even better, worked for the state. Kind regards, Marcus.
Lots of people feel like you do, Marcus. This is from Edward. Dear Alison and Liam, I've become a regular listener to the Essential podcast, and it was nice to see Alison speak at the Together event on the weekend. Leopard print never fails. Thank you, Edward. I am one of those feeling hated and threatened by our current government. I'm English, white, middle-aged, Catholic, happily married, a loving father to 2 wonderful daughters who are at boarding school, an employer of nearly 30 people, a small landowner, and a lover of all things Great Britain and our history. Added to my life in 2021 was Parkinson's disease at the age of 50, which my family, and in particular my wonderful wife, are taking in their stride and getting on with, as you must. Coincidentally, my father-in-law has now also been diagnosed with Parkinson's at a more mature age. Due to other health conditions and those of my mother-in-law, they've been judged eligible to receive financial assistance from the state through the provision of personal independence payments, PIP payments. Over the last year, they've been nudging me to check my eligibility, as they know the burden of care on their daughter will not be decreasing as the years go by. Having read about the sheer size of the sums being spent on PIPs and the rumours that you only had to mention mental health, the new bad back, to obtain them, I gave in recently after a bad few months and thought I would see where I sit in the criteria for this assistance. My family do not readily take from the state. It's just not in our DNA. So this was quite a big decision for me to even go on the website. After quite a bit of form filling, says Edward, several weeks went by, then came a lengthy and suitably testing telephone assessment. I answered honestly as to my current improved status and awaited the results. Now, bearing in mind, I gather the original intention of the PIPs was to enable people to get help to remain in gainful employment, thus staying as contributors to our nation's coffers, aside from those too old or too sick to work. I was reasonably satisfied to be sent the result that I was not eligible for PIPs. The main reason for this email, says Edward, is that I scored a whopping 0 in all categories of eligibility, leading obviously to an overall score of 0. So who the hell is getting these PIPs if I can be living with a progressive neurological movement disorder and not score a single point? Please add it to your mission list to lift the lid on who exactly is getting these PIPs and perhaps more exposure of the system being exploited will revitalise the political will to reduce them. Too often the drains on the benefit system are all bundled together and we cannot see the wood from the trees. I await news of an intrepid team being appointed to the task, says Edward. Keep up the good work. Well, quite clearly, Liam, it looks like Edward is a contributor, an employer, a higher rate taxpayer, and when his own health deteriorates, he's not eligible for anything from the state. How disgusting.
This is from David. Denmark proves that the ECHR is a red herring. The Danes, also signatories to the ECHR, kick out the people they don't want. They also tell the truth about the criminal propensities of specific nationalities, whereas the UK claims its hands are tied and that rapists and other assorted felons are forced upon us because of their so-called human rights. The core problem with the UK, says David, is gutless politicians backed up by a left-wing civil service and left-wing judiciary. And this is from Peter. The entire asylum and mass immigration industry is an insult to the working class. They don't own shares, so they don't profit from cheap labour. They're not secure in the belief that they'll go unpunished if they ignore societal norms, breach planning regulations, or engage in criminal activity that gets ignored in other ethnic groups for the sake of social cohesion. They do, however, get displaced from access to public services, social housing, and access to jobs, says Peter. They do see their neighbourhoods rot around them in ways their lords and masters don't. They experience the crime and social decay their so-called betters do not. And finally, Alison, Bob the Bard struck again. Here he is. Dear Planet Normal, we'll do a verse each. I share your concern about how the BBC's become captured by ideological zealots. I'm afraid that this issue has upset me so much, it has driven me to write yet another dreadful poem. Thanks again for Planet Normal, says Bob. Never mind the BBC. Long live the RRT, brackets, rocket of right thinking. Regards, Bob. And here we go, Alison. There's something wrong with Auntie. Auntie filled my childhood with wonder and delight. I'd hear her in the mornings and see her day and night.
There's so many things she taught me and stories she used to tell. I trusted her, looked up to her, and she made me laugh as well.
But in recent years, I've noticed, to my horror and surprise, she's started shouting nonsense and even spreading lies.
She tells me that she hates me and loathes our country too. She bores me with her ranting and her balmy points of view.
Auntie, I'm really sorry, but I can't bear you anymore. And I just wish that you could be the way that you were before.
Oh.
Hooray! And on that Bob the Bard bombshell, that's it from Planet Normal for another week. So we leave our sanctuary of sweet reason, our flying refuge of reason views. Email of the week, it's my turn, and it has to be self-employed electrician Marcus. We know you get up early. You are part of the alarm clock classes, but when we send you your rare as Rocking Horse Poo Planet Normal mug, you can use it in the morning. So send us an email with your postal address, put mug winner in the subject heading, and we will send that mug to you.
If you've enjoyed this episode of Planet Normal, we jolly well hope you have, please subscribe and leave a review and a rating wherever you listen.
And we'll be back next week for our Planet Normal budget special. So join us then. And thanks finally to our producers, Cass Ho, James Hodgson and Louisa Wells. Stay safe and in touch with us and with each other. Until next week, it's goodbye from me.
3 leading economists next week, and it's goodbye from him.
I'm number 3.
I'm number 1.